My name is Robin Christopher. I fell during gym class and fractured my skull. They took me to the nurse's office where I would come to just long enough to vomit and then pass out again. This happened several times. I remember seeing the man who worked for my father sitting on a chair next to the cot that I was laying on. My father never liked me, and he couldn't be bothered to go to the school when they called him, so he sent his employee. My stepmother was at the hairdresser's at the time, and they were unable to get hold of her. In the ambulance, I remember my father's employee sitting near the head of the gurney that I was laying on. He was pressed against the wall between the front and the back of the ambulance and looking through the little window in the wall. He asked the driver if he could turn the siren off because it was making me nervous. He had not turned to look at me once. He was nervous, not me. I found that funny. Anyhow, every now and then things would go black, but later I would be aware of everything around me again. I remember when the ambulance got to the hospital, a man opened the back door and pulled my gurney out of the back of the vehicle. Then everything went black again. The next thing I remember is being pushed down a long hall at a great speed. When we reached the end of the hall, the person who was pushing my gurney almost came to a stop and made a sharp turn into this big room. It reminded me of the school cafeteria because there were a lot of curtains lining the wall to the right of the doorway. Once my gurney was completely in the room, the person pushing it turned it sideways and started pulling it, head first, to an area to the left of the door. The gurney came to a stop in front of this massive metal thing. I was fascinated by it and likened it to a big metal dinosaur. Of course, today I know that it was an X-ray machine, but I had never had an X-ray before that, so I had no idea what it was at the time. I was busy studying the massive machine when clanging noises drew my attention away from it. By the way, the X-ray machine was to my right and partially beyond the head of my gurney. At that point, in time, I was facing the door, way down and to the right of the gurney. The clanging noises were coming from behind the gurney and to the left. The noise drew my attention away from the dinosaur, and I turned to see two men in hospital uniforms scurrying about. Both of them appeared to be rather short, around 5'4" to 5'6" tall. One was white with a very light complexion. He had blonde hair with a receding hairline. The other appeared to be of Hispanic descent. He had black hair, darker skin, and was balding too. The white man was the shortest, and he was a little heavier for his size than the dark-haired man was, but they were both trim. One man wore a watch with silver, stretch band on it, and the other wore one with a black leather band. I used to be able to remember which man wore which watch, but that part of my memory has faded with time. The men were fooling around with some things that looked like handheld blackboards or slates. I got really excited because a handheld blackboard and chalk had been my favorite Christmas present when I was about 4 or 5 years old. I was curious as to what they were doing with them. It didn't make any sense to me since neither of them had any chalk. What good is a blackboard without it? While still watching the two men, a noise down by the door drew my attention away from them. I turned and looked to see an Indian, from India, doctor come in with my father's employee following close behind. How I knew that the man was a doctor is beyond me, but I somehow knew it. The doctor and the other man stood against the wall where the curtains and windows were. The doctor was looking my way, and the man who worked for my father was actually trying to interest him in buying a car. Strangely enough, I could feel what the doctor was feeling even though he kept a straight face the whole time. He was angry and disgusted with the man for even thinking about selling a car when I was lying on the other side of the room, possibly dying. In any case, I had no interest in the two of them, and I turned back to see what the two men with the black boards were doing. Shortly after that, I heard another noise coming from the door, so I turned back toward it. It was my stepmother. She walked into the room with a "Please, someone give me some good news" look on her face, stopping several feet in front of the doctor and my father's employee. The man who worked for my father looked scared, so he turned to the doctor as if to say, "You tell her, Doc." The doctor then told my stepmother that they didn't expect me to make it through the night. At that point, my stepmother let out a horrible scream and started to faint. The man who worked for my father ran up and caught her so that she wouldn't hit the floor. I was ticked. I couldn't understand why the doctor would have told her something like that. I yelled, "Don't listen to him, Mom. Look at me. I'm fine." For some strange reason, she couldn't seem to hear me. I kept yelling, but she paid me no mind. Then, without even thinking, I said to myself, "Oh, she can't hear me like this." I have no idea why I said that or what I meant. I must have somehow known that I was in some form other than physical. How I knew it, I do not know. All that I can figure is that the form that I was in must have been familiar to me. Perhaps that is why I was not scared when I realized that I was in some form other than human. In any case, the second that I said that, I felt as though I were being sucked down through a vacuum cleaner hose. I could actually hear the air swirling around me. Then I had a really hard crash landing into my body, and the second that I got back in it, I started squirming, looking for a way back out. I kept saying that I wanted out of there because my body was so cold, hard, heavy, and confining. Strangely enough, I had not given any thought to how I felt while out of my body until I got back in it and had something to compare it to. While out of my body, I felt free, as though I had no boundaries. It seemed that I was part of everything, and everything was part of me, as though we melted together and were one, but at the same time, I was still a separate entity. I know that sounds confusing, but that is how I felt. Plus, there was this wonderful sense of warmth, not like the warmth of temperature, but rather the warmth of love. The closest thing that I can relate it to is when my daughter was 4, she came in to go to the bathroom. I was sitting on the sofa at the time. When she was done, rather than going right back out to play, she ran over to me, threw her tiny arms around my neck, and for no reason at all said, "Mommy, I love you," when she did that. The warmest sensation swept down me from my head to my feet. Still trying to find a way back out of my body, the sound of my stepmother crying caught my attention once again. I totally put my discomfort aside and started trying to calm her down again. I tried to open my mouth to call to her, but for some reason my mouth wouldn't open. I had no idea why, but I assumed that it had something to do with my fall. I figured that since I couldn't talk, I would just wave my arms back and forth until I got her attention. I figured that if she saw me waving my arms, she would know that I was okay and stop crying. Unfortunately, my arms would not move. It felt as though they were encased in cement, and no matter how hard I tried, I could not so much as budge them. Undeterred, I decided that if my arms would not move, I would just kick my feet until she noticed, but they too were as heavy as cement, and I could not move them. At that point, I began to get frightened, and I turned my attention back to me, forgetting about my stepmother. I tried to wiggle the toes on one of my feet, but they too were immovable. Then I tried to wiggle the ones on the other foot, and they followed suit. At that point, I panicked, thinking that maybe I was paralyzed by the fall. Instantly, everything went black, and that is all I remember until I woke up almost a month later. When I woke up, I saw my stepmother sitting on a chair next to my bed reading a magazine. I looked over and said, "I'm hungry. Can I have something to eat?" She was in shock. She jumped up and ran out to get a nurse. The nurse checked me and then called the doctor. For the next few hours, a barrage of interns, doctors, and nurses went in and out of my room. I felt like a freak in a freak show that was on display. When the activity died down, I was relieved to finally have some time alone with my stepmother. I apologized for having made her cry. She was confused and asked what I was talking about. I explained how she cried after the doctor told her that I wasn't expected to make it through the night when she first arrived at the hospital. My stepmother kept saying that I couldn't have known those things. She said that I went into a coma in the ambulance before I ever got to the hospital. I had no idea what a coma was, but I knew that she was wrong. We argued about it for a few moments, and then to prove that I was right, I told her exactly what she was wearing when she had arrived. To this day, I remember it. She had on a sleeveless baby blue knit jumper that had a low waist. There was a band around the waist that sat on her hips, and from the band down there were pleats all around. I explained that she was carrying her white patent leather purse and wearing matching high heels. At that point, she got a horrifying look on her face, and again insisted that I couldn't possibly have known that. And then she said that she didn't ever want to talk about it again. So we never did. After I went home, I would get the feeling that someone was watching me while I was doing my chores. I would turn, and there my stepmother would be, just staring a hole in me. I would ask her to please stop it, and she would just shake her head and walk away saying that I was not the same person ever since my accident, meaning the fractured skull. Interestingly enough, after the fracture I started seeing and or hearing ghosts, but that is another story. In any case, I have no fear of death at all because of this experience. In fact, I look forward to feeling that free and warm again. If you found Robin's story interesting, you would absolutely love this one. Watch it next.